The rooster in Miller's yard across the road had opinions about the hour, and Thomas Ward had long ago stopped arguing with them. He lay a moment in the gray dark with his eyes open, listening to the bird work through its whole repertoire, and then to the quieter sounds beneath it. Hannah's slow breathing beside him, the creak of the elm outside the window, shifting its weight in the first small wind of the morning, the deep autumn stillness of a Vermont village that had not yet decided to wake. Somewhere down the road, a door opened and closed. Somewhere further off, a cow made a single unhurried remark and thought better of it. He rose without hurry, because there was no part of his day that rewarded hurry, and dressed by feel in the dark. Wool trousers, the flannel shirt gone soft at the elbows from 11 years of washing, the heavy leather apron he would not put on until he was in the shop, but which he carried down over his arm all the same, the way another man might carry a coat. His boots he took up in one hand and did not put on until he reached the kitchen, out of a habit formed when the children were small and easily woken, and kept now long after the youngest had grown past waking at anything less than a dropped kettle. The kitchen stove still held a bed of coals from the night before, and he fed it kindling and waited, hands on the warm iron, until the fire took hold with a sound like paper being crumpled somewhere far away. Hannah came down while the coffee was still working itself up to a boil, her hair pinned up, and moved around him in the small room with the particular ease of two people who had spent a decade learning each other's habits in a space too narrow for both of them at once. "Ellis Barnard's wagon," she said. It was not quite a question. "Today," he agreed. "The tire's off it, and the fellows are shrunk near a 1/4 inch. It's been coming since spring. He'll want it by dark. He'll get it by 3 if the fire behaves and nobody comes in wanting something urgent." He drank the coffee scalding, standing, the way he always did, and set the cup in the basin. "Somebody always comes in wanting something urgent." She gave him a look that agreed with him entirely, and said nothing, and he took his apron and went out into the yard. The shop stood 40 feet from the house, a low building of unpainted boards weathered to the color of a mourning dove, its wide double doors facing the road so that a man could drive a team straight in out of the weather if he had to. Thomas swung them open and let the morning in. Inside, the air held the smell it always held, and that he had long since stopped noticing, except on mornings like this one, when the cold made it sharper. Coal smoke soaked into every board, hot iron, hoof parings, the machine oil he kept in a can on the windowsill, and underneath all of it, the faintly sweet scent of the ash pit. He raked out yesterday's clinker, laid a handful of shavings in the hollow of the forge, and set a few lumps of good bituminous coal around them in a loose ring. Then he took the crank of the blower in his right hand and turned it slowly, feeling the fan spin up, and the shavings caught and the coal began to take, first at the edges and then all through, going from black to dull red to a red so bright it lost its color entirely and became simply light. He banked the green coal up around the fire's edge in a wall, the way his father had shown him, so the heart of it stayed clean, and the coking coal at the rim could give up its smoke and turn to coke of its own accord before it was ever needed. By the time the fire had settled into a steady heat, the sun had come up over Perkins's hill and was lying in a long yellow bar across the shop floor, full of coal dust turning slowly in the draft. He began, as he began most mornings, with the small work, The jobs that wanted a moderate fire and no great thinking, and that let his hands and his shoulders remember what they were for before the day asked anything serious of them. A pair of strap hinges for the Whitcomb barn door. He cut the stock from a bar of flat iron, worked it into the fire, and watched the color come up through it. Black, then a dull red at the edges, then cherry, then the bright orange that meant the iron had stopped being a thing that resisted him and had become something closer to clay. Out with the tongs, onto the anvil face, and the hammer came down. That was the sound that governed the village, and everyone in it knew it, without particularly hearing it any more. 2 heavy blows on the hot iron, then a light ringing tap on the anvil face itself, then 2 more. The smith's rhythm, older than the town, the tap serving no purpose but to let the hammer bounce and give the arm its half-second of rest, so that a man could go on doing this all day and still be able to lift his own supper fork at the end of it. Ring, ring, tink, ring, ring, tink. Out on the road, a man walking to the store heard it and knew the shop was open, and knew roughly what was being worked and roughly how far along it was, without ever once looking up. He drew the strap out long, tapered the end, punched the nail holes hot with a punch and a hearty hole beneath, and curled the eye around the horn of the anvil in 3 easy passes. When it had gone from orange down to a dark plum, he set it in the slack tub, and the water swallowed it with a sound like a great indrawn breath, and let out a column of steam that climbed into the sunlight and came apart there. The second hinge went quicker than the first, as second things generally did. He had barely set them both aside to cool when the light in the doorway changed, and a horse's shadow came across the floor. It was Ned Corbin's gray mare, and Ned behind her, leading her in on a loose rope with the expression of a man apologizing in advance. "Offside 4, Ned said. "Threw it somewhere between here and the creek, and I couldn't tell you where if you paid me. Bring her round." The mare came in willingly enough. She had been in this shop 100 times, and she knew the smell of it and the sound of it, and had decided years ago that neither meant her any harm. Thomas ran a hand down her shoulder and along the leg, and she gave him the foot before he had properly finished asking for it, leaning her weight over onto the other 3 with the resigned patience of a horse who has done all this before and expects to do it again. He set the hoof between his knees and looked at it. The wall had chipped a little where the shoe had gone, but the sole was sound and the frog was healthy, and there was nothing there that a good trim in a new shoe would not put entirely right. He took the hoof knife and pared the sole back to clean white horn, working slowly, and then the rasp, drawing it level across the bearing surface in long, even strokes, checking it against his eye, taking a little more off the outside quarter, checking again. The parings curled away and dropped, and the shop filled with that smell that belonged to no other work, dry and faintly sweet, like new-cut wood and old cheese arguing. He picked a keg shoe close to the size he wanted, heated it, and shaped it on the horn, a little wider through the quarters, the heels evened, the toe brought to match the outline of the foot he had in his mind. Then he took it to the hoof hot and set it, and the pale smoke came up around it with that scorched hair smell that made strangers wince and made the mare do absolutely nothing at all, because there is no feeling in a hoof wall, and she knew it better than most people did. "Sits well," he said, mostly to himself. He cooled the shoe and nailed it on. 7 nails, each one driven at the angle that would bring its point out through the wall high enough to hold and far enough forward to miss anything that mattered. The nails came through, and he twisted the ends off with the claw and rasped them flush and turned the clinches down with a light hammer against the clinch block and set the foot down, and the mare put her weight on it and shifted once and accepted it. 60 cents, Thomas said. You'll take it Saturday? I'll take it Saturday. Ned led the mare out into the yard and away up the road, and the shop was quiet again except for the fire. Hannah brought his dinner out at noon, as she did every day the weather allowed. Cold ham, bread, an apple, and a pot of coffee. And he ate it, sitting on an upturned nail keg in the doorway, with the sun on his boots and the fire ticking behind him. The maples along the road had gone over entirely in the last week, and the whole hillside behind Perkins' place stood in that particular red that only lasts about 4 days in the year and that nobody who lives there ever quite gets used to. A wagon went by. The driver raised a hand, and Thomas raised his, and neither of them said anything, and both were satisfied. Then it was time for the tire. Ellis Barnard's rear wheel stood against the shop wall where it had stood since yesterday afternoon, a good hickory-spoked wheel with white oak felloes that had dried out over a hot summer until the whole thing had gone loose in itself, spokes rattling in their mortices, the iron tire riding slack on wood that had shrunk away from it. It was the most satisfying job in the trade, and Thomas had never once admitted this to anybody. He measured the wheel with the traveler, a small iron wheel on a handle, run around the fellow rim, counting the revolutions and the fraction. Then he ran it around the inside of the tire and counted that. The difference told him precisely how much iron he had to take out, and he took it out at the fire, cutting the tire, heating the ends to a bright orange, scarfing them, and welding them together on the anvil with a flux of clean sand and 3 fast, heavy blows before the heat could leave. The weld took. It nearly always took. It had been 22 years since one hadn't, and he still gave that first blow the same attention he'd given it at 19. The tire went into the fire proper then. A long ring of iron laid across a bed of coals raked out in a circle in the yard, brush and scrap wood heaped over it, the whole thing lit and left to burn down, while the iron came up slowly and evenly to a dull glowing red all the way round. Thomas stood back from it with a rake in his hand, moving a stick here, pulling a coal there, keeping the heat even, watching the color creep along the ring like something filling up. The wheel he had already laid flat and bolted down on the tire platform, a heavy iron plate set on a stump in the middle of the yard with a bucket of water and a dipper standing beside it and 2 pairs of long tongs laid ready. When the tire had come up all round, he called toward the house, and Hannah came out, drying her hands, and their eldest, Frank, 14 and half a head taller than he'd been in the spring, came around from the woodpile at a run because he would not have missed this for anything. They lifted the ring out of the fire together with the long tongs, 3 sets of hands, and carried it, glowing, to the platform and dropped it over the wheel. It fell true. It always had to fall true. There was no second attempt available to a man, and Thomas took up the sledge and struck it down over the felloes in 4 hard blows around the rim, while the wood beneath it began to smoke. "Water," he said, and Frank was already pouring. And then the thing happened that Thomas had watched perhaps 2,000 times and had never got tired of. The water hit the hot iron and went up in a great white cloud, and the tire, cooling, began to shrink. It shrank down onto the wood with a low, groaning creak that came up through the platform and through the stump and into the soles of your boots, and the whole wheel drew itself tight, spokes pulling home into their mortises with small sharp knocks, one after another around the circle, the felloes closing on their joints, the entire assembly of 30-odd separate pieces of wood and iron becoming, over the course of about 8 seconds, a single object. The steam went up through the red maples. The knocking stopped. The wheel stood there on the plate, tight as a drum, hot and hissing and entirely fixed. Frank let out a breath. "It never stops being good," he said. "No," his father agreed. "It doesn't." They unbolted it and rolled it into the shade and left it to finish cooling, and Thomas went back inside and did not do very much of anything for about 5 minutes. The afternoon filled itself up the way afternoons did. He put a new point on a plowshare for a man from the north end of town. He mended a length of trace chain, drawing the broken link out, forging a new one, closing it, welding it shut. He straightened a bent gate hook and refused to be paid for it. Sarah Whitcomb came for the hinges and stayed 20 minutes at the door talking about her sister in Rutland, and Thomas listened with about half his attention and all of his courtesy while his hands went on working a piece of quarter-round stock into a hook for a hay rope. Toward 4, the light in the doorway went long and orange, and the shop began to go dim in the corners. He cleaned up, hammers back on the rack in order of weight, tongs hung by size, the floor swept of parings and scale, the water in the slack tub topped off from the bucket. Then he raked the coal up over the fire's heart, damped it down, and stood a moment watching the red go unto the black. Ellis Barnard came at 4:30 for his wheel and turned it once with his hand and pronounced himself satisfied in the fewest available words, which from Ellis was a considerable statement, and paid in cash, and went off down the road with the wheel rolling beside him. Supper was potatoes and salt pork and the last of the beans from the garden. At the kitchen table with the lamp lit in the middle of it, all 5 of them, Thomas, Hannah, Frank, and the 2 girls, Ruth and little Cora, who was 6 and had spent the entire day at some project of her own involving acorns and had a great deal to report about it. Thomas listened to the acorn business with genuine attention and asked 2 questions about it, which was 2 more than Cora had expected and which she took as her due. Afterward, he sat in the chair by the stove with his boots off and his feet toward the warmth, and did nothing in particular, which was the whole point of the chair. Hannah cleared and washed, and then sat across from him with her work basket. Frank read a page of something at the table with his chin on his fist. The girls played at cat's cradle on the floor until Ruth's string knotted itself past saving, and the game ended in the way those games always ended. The lamp burned steady and yellow. Outside the window the last of the light went off the top of Perkins's hill, and the color drained out of the maples until they were only shapes, and then not even that. He sent the children up at 8, and heard the floorboards overhead go quiet by degrees. Cora first, then Ruth, then Frank a good while later, after the sort of reading a boy does when he has decided the day is not finished with him yet. Thomas banked the kitchen stove and checked the door and stood a moment at the window looking out at the black shape of the shop across the yard, where under all that damped coal a small, deep red heart of fire was still holding on, and would still be holding on at 4 a.m, and would come back to full life tomorrow with nothing more than a handful of shavings and about 90 seconds of the crank. He went up. The bedroom was cold, the way the upstairs of that house was always cold from October on, but the bed had been made up with the heavy wool blankets a week ago, and it took only a minute or two under them before the cold gave up and went elsewhere. His body reported on the day in the plain way it always did. The good, deep ache across both shoulders that meant a proper amount of hammer work, and not too much. The warmth still living in his forearms, which never entirely left them in any season. A small stiffness in his left hand that had been arriving a little earlier each autumn for 3 years now, and that he regarded with mild interest and no concern at all. He turned onto his side. Hannah's weight settled into the mattress beside him. He thought, without any urgency, about tomorrow, a set of andirons somebody wanted, and the Corbin mare's other 3 feet, which would want doing before the month was out, and a length of stock he ought to order from the foundry before the roads turned. None of it needed thinking about now. It arranged itself somewhere at the back of his mind in the order it would want doing, and then left him alone. Somewhere below, the kitchen stove ticked as it cooled. Out across the yard, the forge held its banked red under its blanket of coal, patient, giving up its heat to the dark by degrees. The elm outside the window moved once in the wind and settled, and in the space behind his closed eyes, going slower and slower as it went, the rhythm of the whole day was still running itself out, the way it always did at this hour, the way it had every night for 22 years, 2 heavy strokes and a light one, 2 heavy and a light, ring, ring, tink, ring, ring, tink, until the strokes came further and further apart and slower and further apart than that, and finally stopped altogether, and Thomas Ward slept.